All right, today we're cracking open the Psychologist's Toolkit. We're going to see the exact methods they use to figure out what's going on inside our own heads. I mean, think about it for a second. How do you scientifically study a feeling or an idea? You can't just put a thought under a microscope, right? It's a huge challenge. But over the years, psychologists have come up with some pretty ingenious ways to do just that.
And the best way to picture these methods is to think of them as a toolkit. You wouldn't use a sledgehammer to fix a watch. And it's the same idea here. Psychologists have to pick the perfect tool for the specific question they're trying to answer. So let's open this thing up and see what we've got. First up, we've got the heavy hitter, the power tool of the bunch. This is the one you pull out when you want to answer the biggest question of all. Does one thing actually cause another thing to happen?
This is the experimental method. And honestly, it's the gold standard in psychology for a reason. It's the only method that lets a researcher say with confidence, yep, this thing caused that thing. It's all about taking control. You deliberately change one thing to see what effect it has on something else. So how does it actually work? Well, let's say you want to test if caffeine improves test scores. The thing you change, the caffeine, that's your independent variable. The thing you measure, the scores on the test, that's your dependent variable. So your experimental group gets the coffee and your control group gets a placebo, like decaf. Then you just compare the scores. Simple as that. But here's the catch. The huge advantage, obviously, is that you can prove cause and effect. But the downside, experiments can be kinda artificial. A lab isn't the real world. And more importantly, there are some major ethical lines you just can't cross. You can't experimentally study the effects of child abuse, for example. It's just not something you can do.
So what do you do when you can't or really shouldn't manipulate something? What if you just want to know if two things are somehow connected? For that, we need a totally different tool.
And that tool is the correlational method. This is where you don't mess with anything. You just measure things as they already exist out in the world. For instance, you might measure how many hours of video games people play and also measure their aggression levels to see if there's a link, a pattern, between the two. Now, to describe that link, psychologists boil it all down to one single number. It's called the correlation coefficient, or just R. And don't let the letters scare you. It tells you two really simple things. The direction of the relationship, is it positive or negative, and how strong it is. So a number like this, negative 0.78, tells us two things. First, it's negative, which means the variables move in opposite directions, like a seesaw. As one goes up, the other goes down. And second, the number's pretty close to -1, which means it's a really strong connection. For instance, as the hours you practice a skill go up, the number of mistakes you make tends to go down. That's a negative correlation. And here we are. This might be the single most important sentence in all of psychology. I want you to burn it into your brain. Correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. Maybe a third thing is causing both. This tool is fantastic at finding patterns, but it can never, ever tell you why that pattern exists.
Okay, so if experiments can be too controlled and correlations can't prove what causes what else have we got in the toolkit? Well, sometimes the most direct approach is the best one. Just watching people or, asking them what's up.
First, we have observation, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. Naturalistic observation is when you go out into the wild, so to speak, like a researcher hiding in the bushes at a park to see how kids share toys. Then there's laboratory observation, where you bring those kids into a controlled room with specific toys to see how they behave. One's real world, one's more controlled. We've also got surveys, which are amazing for getting a snapshot of what thousands of people think or feel about something really quickly. And on the total opposite end of the spectrum is the case study. This is where a researcher goes super deep, studying just one person or a tiny group, usually because their situation is incredibly rare or fascinating. Now, these methods give you incredibly rich, authentic data, but they come with their own traps. With observation, you have to worry about observer bias, where the researcher's own expectations change what they see. And with surveys, you've got response bias, where people might not tell you the total truth, but instead give the answer they think you want to hear. Okay, for our last stop, let's pull out some of the more specialized gear. These are the tools for looking at how we change over time and for peering right into the brain itself.
So how do we study how people grow and change? Well, a longitudinal study is kind of like making a documentary. You follow the exact same group of people for years, even decades, checking in on them to see what's different. A cross-sectional study is more like taking a snapshot. You grab a bunch of 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds all at once and compare them.
And this is where we get into the really high-tech kind of sci-fi stuff. Using tools like an EEG to measure brain waves or an fMRI to see which parts of the brain are lighting up with blood flow, psychologists can literally watch the brain as it thinks and feels. This is how we build a bridge between the mind and the physical brain.
So, as you can see, there are a lot of different tools in this kit. And maybe the most important skill a psychologist can have is knowing exactly which tool to pull out for which job.
Let's just run through it one last time. You want to know if a new drug causes better memory? That's a job for the experimental method. You want to know if there's a link between how much money people make and how happy they are? You need a correlational study. And if you just want to know how bosses really act in meetings, well, you got to observe them, see? Every question has its perfect tool.
Look, getting a handle on these methods is really the first step to thinking like a psychologist. It's what lets us go from just guessing about why people do what they do to asking smart, testable questions. So now that you've had a peek inside the toolkit, I'll leave you with a question. What mystery of the human mind would you want to solve first?